assistant principal, administrator. He served on our board for many, many years. He's a great friend to the museum. He was very instrumental in starting Road Scholars, or getting it started back up. And that big blue bus you see riding around, Mr. Kyle took care of that. So we are very thrilled to have him. Please give him a warm round welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I haven't been back to the museum to volunteer since COVID, and but I was going through some files and I remembered this presentation, and I saw the Tuesday lecture series in the spring, and so I called Cindy and said, could you use one? And she said, certainly. And Cindy posted it as Stories of Assateague. And I had originally said it was the history of Assateague, and I actually think Cindy's choice was a lot better. Because if I get anything wrong, you can just say, oh, that was Jim telling stories. Okay? So, as Lynn said, I was in education most of my life. I'm what's called a come here as compared to a Teaguer. Okay? I love history, and so for a program of Rhodes Scholars, I put this together for an evening program. If you ever take a Rhodes Scholar program, fantastic program, and usually in the evenings they have some other type of educational program, and this was an evening program for one of them. In all honesty, though, being a come here, a Teaguer might say, well, heck, Jim, I forgot more than you ever knew about Assateague. So don't hesitate if you have a question or you want to add something to what I said, because we can all learn from that. So don't hesitate to interject at a certain time. If we start, we're going to go back 10 or 15,000 years, give or take a few. Okay? And I'll explain the map a little more, but 10 or 15,000 years ago puts us when the glaciers were at their last maximum peak. So the sea level was quite a bit lower on the Earth because the glaciers had locked up all that water in glaciers. So it used to be, here's our eastern shore, and this is about Chincoteague right in here, but the ocean used to be 40 miles out at the continental shelf. Okay? There were small rivers. This was higher land. There were small rivers coming out of here. So now if you go fishing and someone talks about, I went out to the canyons, they're actually not the canyons, they're an old river valley that they're fishing in now. And of course, the Chesapeake Bay wasn't there 10,000 years ago, it was the Susquehanna River Valley. And curiously too, the Susquehanna used to exit right out through here into the ocean. And what had happened as the glaciers began to melt, and it would send all that detritus and rocks and debris, everything down the rivers, the Delaware River was quite large. So the fact that we have the state of Delaware here is actually a result of the Delaware River and everything it dumped down into here. And as the Delaware River would dump things, then the Susquehanna has to work farther to get around all that, and so eventually the Susquehanna was moved down to its mouth right here. And as you go through the one tunnel going over to Norfolk, the first tunnel, you're going down in the channel created by the Susquehanna versus the next tunnel is the channel created by the James. Okay, the reason I tell you that is also I think it's called the Gitmer site, but as some scallop fishermen were working this part of the continental shelf, and you're dragging along the bottom to go after scallops, what did they pull up but mastodon bones, mastodon tusks? In fact, some of those bones that they pulled up are in the museum. They were found out here, along with a number of Native American artifacts, tools, points, things like that. That, of course, is under about 200 to 300 feet of water, I think, way out here. But that's how we begin Assateague as high ground, as the mountainous area, so to speak, with the sea 40 miles away. So let's advance to the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s. Assateague as we know it today was not very big. Assateague, if you wanted to call Assateague, it was right here. Then there was another island here, and another one here, and another, because there were numerous inlets into Chincoteague Bay. And those inlets have a tendency to silt up and fill in. So over time, they have filled in. So there's one contiguous island. In fact, Assateague almost went all the way up to Fenwick Island. And there was a small town called Ocean City up here. And it was a small town at that time. And they were petitioning the Army Corps of Engineers to, could you dig a channel through Assateague? Because we would like to create more tourism in Ocean City. And we have that beautiful back bay behind Ocean City. It would be great if we had a channel here. And you know what it's like dealing with the government. They did one study, and then they did another study, and a study after that, and they never could get their channel. Well, Mother Nature solved the problem. Mother Nature came by with a hurricane, I think it was 1936. It didn't hit the ocean, it hit back in here so hard with so much rain that as it filled all the rivers in this area, Chincoteague Bay overflowed and created its own channel at Ocean City. Took out part of the railroad, as it did, but once the channel was there, they didn't hesitate to put in the, what do you call it, the breakwaters or so to make sure the channel stayed. The other story is I live at the upper end of Chincoteague, up towards the end of Deep Hole Road. The reason it's called Deep Hole Road is because of this inlet here, there was a very deep channel. In fact, if you're a fisherman or a boater and you leave Oyster Bay, it is yet a very deep channel, maybe about 30 feet deep. And that's where it gets the name Deep Hole. But there was a town, even though the town of Chincoteague first formed way here on the western side, there was a small town up here, and I like to tell the story of why they were there. Prior to the American Revolution, it's the British who set the laws for here. And like any government, it's all about the money. So they set up official ports of entry. As you were bringing things into the colonies, you could only stop, you had to stop first at official ports of entry. And when you did, of course, the tax collector came on the ship and he could see everything you're bringing in and you got taxed. Unless, of course, you could slip in through this channel and quietly offload anything you want at a small town called Deep Hole. And so I like to say we up at the northern end of Chincoteague, we're all just a bunch of smugglers. Okay? That channel closed up about 1803, but to show you the connection to that, if you on Main Street now, and it didn't used to be on Main Street, but you're familiar with the Timothy Hill house. That used to be, if you drive up Deep Hole Road, you'll see Timothy Hill Lane. That's where the Hill house used to be. Captain Hill was on a ship out in this area, and this area is notorious for shipwrecks because it's so shallow. And in the old days, you navigated by staying close to the coast, so you were taking your chances anytime you went through this area. And his ship got caught in a storm. He was shipwrecked. He washed ashore at Assateague, came over to Chincoteague, decided he liked it, and raised his family, built a home there in Deep Hole. If you go to the Timothy Hill house, just as you're entering the front door, if you look just to the left, you can still see it even if you pull off into their parking area, you will see scratched in the logs scratchings of sailing ships. They think that that is one of Timothy Hill's children. Whatever he saw out front, those were ships docked at Deep Hole, and some of them got immortalized in his house. Original graffiti, you might say. Okay? The other curious thing is, and we'll get to that in an upcoming slide, is Assateague keeps growing this way because the natural currents tend to move sand from the northern up to the southern end. So at a certain point, and I'll show you on the next slide, some of Chincoteague was exposed to the ocean. Now we have Assateague, which is a barrier protecting all of Chincoteague. But this is Assateague in here. This is Tom's Cove. This is what they call the hook down in here. When you go to the beach, you're right here. If you're over where we are, you're up here. So you would cross, and so you have to help me with your imagination. We're on Assateague right here. But the reason these lines are where they are showing where Assateague ended at a certain point. This one says I believe it's 1859, okay? Assateague ended there. The lighthouse was right here. So people oftentimes ask, why is the lighthouse so far from the ocean? It wasn't. It was facing the ocean when they originally chartered it, or Congress authorized it in the 1830s. In the 1830s, Assateague ended about here. So the lighthouse was at the tip of Assateague in the 1830s. You can see as Assateague has grown, how it has grown, and that's because of sand just naturally migrating that way. Though I'm curious to watch. All we need is one good nor'easter, and we're going to have a new inlet right through here soon, because that's very low. So that's the beautiful thing about these barrier islands, as they move, and we need to remember they move. Like people on the Outer Banks forget that islands move. Okay. Okay, what about human beings on Assateague? As it says there, we never found evidence of a permanent Native American settlement on the island of Assateague. Though there's evidence that they came here. And they came for the same reason that we put on bug spray. They could come out to the tip of Assateague to escape the mosquitoes in the summertime. But there was also a lot of good seafood, and so they'd bring that in. And the fishing they could obviously do. Indians inhabited the mainland, be it Chincoteague or farther in the mainland, but they would come over to Assateague. But not that we know of any permanent villages. But by the 1770s, there were 25 inhabitants on Assateague in what was called Assateague Village. And this view is from the lighthouse, looking down onto the various buildings that made up Assateague Village. So Assateague Village sat at the foot of the lighthouse on this side, facing Chincoteague. It's oftentimes, until you get up to the lighthouse, if you're looking at the lighthouse from Chincoteague, you don't realize it's up on such a high bluff. But you get up to the lighthouse and look down, and that's where the town was. So there were people living around here by the 1770s. They existed, and to me it was an idyllic existence. Seafood, all kinds of seafood, anytime you wanted it. They could grow crops out here. This is farmland. And they also made considerable amount of what they needed by scrounging the beach. Because as I told you, a lot of shipwrecks are out there. And they get caught on the shoals during a storm. The storm beats them to pieces and everything washes ashore. Which brings up the interesting story of James Alone, which you probably heard, but for those of you who haven't, it was about, I'm thinking 1803, after a storm. The villagers of Assateague Village had gone across the island to the ocean side and were searching the beach for whatever had washed up, and they heard a baby cry. And they went running, and there was a baby swaddled up but tied to the hatch cover of a ship. The ship had foundered out in the storm. The parents were probably, as you can imagine, just panicky because during a storm, you're not going to make it as you try and swim in. They could have been 10 miles out, in fact. So the only thing they could to save their child, they ripped off a hatch cover, tied their baby, and hoped Providence would take the baby in. It did. The villagers took the child in, and within a short amount of time, someone on Chincoteague adopted the child. They didn't know his name, so they gave him a name, James Alone, because he arrived here all alone. They do think that it might have been a Spanish ship or one heading to Spain, because he had a different complexion. He had the Mediterranean look, the darker skin, the black hair, compared with a lot of people in Chincoteague or Assateague. But James Alone, like Chincoteague, he stayed here. When he was 21, he did go to Accomac and get his name changed to James Lund, or L-U-N-D or L-U-N-N, and I'm sorry, I don't remember which one. He enjoyed his life enough that he must have had quite a family or quite a lot of fun, because the local Teagers, when they do genealogy studies, find about 30% of them can somehow trace their way back to James Alone. Okay? We're a very friendly group on Chincoteague. That's why I moved here. I love it here. Okay, so the first government presence. In 1833, now again, to get your bearings, here's Chincoteague, where we are, and here's where the museum is, about here. So, and remember, Assateague ended right about here. So Congress authorized in 1833 a lighthouse to be built here. It was on a standard government set of plans, all the same plans up and down through the coast. And so it was awarded to a contractor. He built it, and when he was finished, everyone looked over there and they said, something is wrong, because the lighthouse didn't rise even above the tree level. So someone from the government inspection office came down, went to see the contractor, and they said, I want to see your measuring rod. Now, if you're not familiar, we're used to measuring tapes. They didn't have those in the early 1800s. They had measuring rods, a stick of either a foot length or a yard length or whatever it was. So the contractor pulled out his 1 foot measuring rod, and the guy from Washington, D.C. measured it, and it was 8 inches. So everything that he built was off by, what is that, 1/3? So they had to tear down the lighthouse and start it again. It was just about finished when the Civil War broke out. At one point, the Confederates, who were over here, and that's a whole different story about Chincoteague and the Union and the Confederacy, but they tried to land a party over here to take or dismantle the lighthouse so that the North couldn't have its navigation devices, because the North was putting up ships all around there. But the people from Assateague Village alerted those on Chincoteague, and they were able to beat back the rebels at that time and save the lighthouse, and then it was finished right after the Civil War. Then in 1870, well, and I may have my date here slightly off, but about 1875, the railroad came into a town of Franklin. Now, Franklin is a ghost town right now, but next to it is the town of Greenbackville. And you can still travel to Franklin, and there are a few homes that have been remodeled there. But it was named after the judge who bought the land. He knew the railroad was coming, and then he plotted out a town called Franklin. Once the railroad came in, everything boomed, and there were ships back and forth during all hours of the day and night between the railroad terminal and Chincoteague. And there are some shoals out here also. So the government put up the Killick Shoals Lighthouse. And the only part that's left of it is if you are leaving the island as you just cross the drawbridge, just as you make the curve, if you look out to your right, you will see just like a platform, maybe 300, 400 yards out there. That is what's left of the Killick Shoals Lighthouse. Now, the Killick Shoals Lighthouse was completed, I think, 1885, and by government rules, the first assistant at the closest lighthouse had first dibs on the job. So that takes us over to here. This lighthouse was here, and it went to the first assistant, and he said, oh yeah, because to be the main assistant is a pay raise, and of course it's a government job, and so there's a pension and everything else. So it was a highly sought after job. Unfortunately, we have a model of the Killick Shoals Lighthouse in the museum. It's essentially a one-room house, maybe two. Probably, as a good analogy, it's like those new little cottages that are going in just near the bridge, okay? Well, this man had 3 children and a wife. The light was on top of the house. And after about 4 months of all those kids up in a lighthouse, you can't say like I do with my kids, get your coats on and go outside and play, okay, because it's all water. And he had to row them in the morning and to school and back out. He resigned, okay. So it went to the second assistant, and he and his wife moved over there. Now the second assistant then took the job from about 1886 to 19, I think it was 05. He was so good at his job. He wrote manuals on how to care for the equipment. Every time the government inspector would come out, he would get the highest reviews. In fact, the life-saving service, which was called before the Coast Guard, took his manuals and made those the standard manuals for all over the country. He was so famous that when he passed away, he was saying his evening prayers before dinner. His wife had rowed to Chincoteague to get supplies, and it was dusk, and she looked and the light wasn't on. And she said, that's not good. So she rowed back out and found him. He was still over his bed in this fashion. He'd had a heart attack or a stroke, and that was it, just at that moment. So he passed away. When he passed, he was famous enough, his obituary was in the New York Times, extolling everything that he had done. There was a 1-sentence notice about his death in the local Chincoteague, and that said, the Killick Shoals lighthouse keeper has passed. He will be replaced by a white man. You see, the gentleman who was out there was the first black lighthouse keeper in America. He was famous. But this is 1905, the height of the Jim Crow era. It was hated by Teagers at that time that a black man would get that job. And so they were just furious that he was out there, and that was their statement to him. Now, I will say in defense of Chincoteague and the Eastern Shore, their history before Jim Crow was actually very favorable to the black community, but that's of a different talk sometime. But by 1905, things had changed. And as a sidelight, you know where the carnival grounds is now, was an entire black community. But eventually, through discrimination and lack of job opportunities, they all moved north. And the town bought out the rest of them, and that's where the carnival grounds is. So that was the Killick Shoals Light, and it stayed until the causeway went in, and then the Coast Guard decommissioned, or the Life Saving Service decommissioned it and took it down at a later date. Contrary to what I was told when I first arrived here, I've since learned that this story I'm about to tell you is not true, but I'm going to tell it anyways, okay, just to spread a few rumors. It is not true that the locals in Chincoteague, the parents got together with their boat and tore down the lighthouse because their kids were going out there and having beer parties. But that's what I was told when I got here, and I thought it was a great story, but it's not true. Yes, did you have a question? No. I'm sorry, I thought I saw your hand up. Then there is the last one, the life-saving station service. The government put those in the 1800s. Life-saving stations were all along the East Coast every 15 miles. And the 15 miles was particular because if you worked at the life-saving station, one of you got the task every day to walk north, another one got the task to go south, and don't ask me how they did that here. But walking north is easy to understand. You walked 7.5 miles, and you waited until the person from the Pope Lighthouse Station, Pope Island, walked his 7.5 miles. You met at the middle, and you each had a little punch thing, and you punched each other's cards, so the boss knew that you had walked the 7.5 miles and then walked it back. The whole purpose was you were to look for anybody who was signaling that they were in distress. So obviously it was more important that you walked on the bad weather days rather than the good weather days. Now, the original life-saving station was here. And if you go, as you're coming out Assateague, I think they call it the Pony Overlook Trail. If you've ever been out the Pony Overlook and you get to the Overlook, if you really wanted to go off there, and I'm not sure you're allowed to, and you wanted to brave all the mosquitoes, if you walk a little bit to the west, you'll find an old concrete cistern. That's where the life-saving station was at that point. And then they moved it out here, and that life-saving station you can still see. It's out at the end. Assateague has grown a lot. But that was the government presence on the island, or I should say the first government presence on the island. Okay, just a little sidelight. There was a factory out on Assateague. Again, my map, because of the light, is not showing up well, but let me get you oriented again. This is Tom's Cove. This is the beach. So this was that map earlier that I showed you of how the hook grew. Right out on the hook was a Menhaden factory. And Tom's Cove was quite a bit bigger then. So the ships, Menhaden is like sardines, but bigger, and a very oily fish. In fact, they're having a controversy because we still have Menhaden fishing from the Virginia side of the Chesapeake, and they recently had quite a spill on the Chesapeake when one of their nets cut loose. But this was a plant that produced fish oil and fertilizer. And it was, I think it was here until about the 1930s. I think the Depression did it in. But I will encourage you to go to the museum website, to the Living History page. Listen to Helen Merritt and Roy Jones. Roy Jones lived in Assateague Village. Okay, he just passed away, if I'm not correct, about 1.5 years ago. Lived, I think, to be 101. And then Helen just passed away recently. I used to work with Helen at the election. She was a hoot, even in the 90s to work there. But she's a great storyteller. Her dad was manager at the Menhaden plant. So during the summertime, he rented a house out on Assateague. He would bring her, and she spent her summers on Assateague. So between the memories of those two, you get quite a story about what it was like to live in Assateague Village. I like Roy Jones's final comment that he talks about the village. He said, "We were poor, but we never knew we were poor." And on top of that, he said, "I don't remember any child ever growing hungry, or going to bed hungry," was his phrase, in Assateague Village. And he said, "I don't understand now." And I think he's about, when they recorded, I think he was 99. He said, "I read in the paper that there's so many thousands of children go to bed hungry." He said, "I wish I could feed them all," because he said, "I don't understand that." And he said that's the way life was. They were poor, but they looked out for everyone in the village. So that's a good lead-in to the village. If we were up at the lighthouse and looking down the bluff, this was the legally plotted lands. They would go from the base of the lighthouse all the way to the water's edge. About also where the Park Service has their dock there in that area. Again, this is a picture of Assateague Village. This is the combination church and schoolhouse. the town of the village built it themselves, but they never could attract anyone other than an itinerant minister to come, and very rarely did they have enough children or have the resources monetarily to pay for a teacher. Most of the time the kids had to row across and go to Chincoteague. I put some color coding on this blown up map. That's that same map of Assateague we've been looking at. Here is the lighthouse. Here's the village below it. The reason there's a break between, because the government kept that land as theirs for access to the lighthouse when a boat would come in for supplies. The red dot was their cemetery, which many of you probably visited if you're taking a bicycle and you go over. The moment you get over the bridge, look to the left, you probably see some gravestones. You may even see an American flag because there are veterans there. Walk among that and check it out sometime.
White Hills.
What's that?
It's White Hills area.
Okay. Just north of there, and there's no evidence of it anymore, was their smallpox house. The people of Assateague Village had no doctor, and even though like George Washington had his soldiers vaccinated for smallpox in the 1700s, that idea of vaccination never reached Assateague Village. And so they had a smallpox outbreak. And the only way to deal with it, the family that got it were quickly ushered out of their homes into this quarantine house and were not to come out of that house until it passed. In the meantime, the villagers in Assateague Village burned the family's home, burned all their belongings, because that's the only way they knew how to get rid of the pestilence they called smallpox. And I just keep thinking that those that survived, when they come back and find nothing of theirs there, what they must have felt like. So there was a smallpox or a quarantine house north of the village. Okay, there was a teacher on Chincoteague, and he even occasionally came over to Assateague Village by the name of John Field. John Field, in addition to teaching, he read a lot. And he used to like to read the Virginia statutes. And he came across one that said, any Virginia citizen may patent land that has never been patented before. It's like claiming it. John was smart enough to realize that all of this below the lighthouse, it was marsh or sandy area, that was all new land. So for no cost at all, John filed a patent and began accumulating land on Assateague. He then bought up some more land on Assateague. Now here's the lighthouse and here's the village, so he couldn't buy that. And then his son Sam. John moved away, I think, to the Baltimore area, and his son Sam lived in Baltimore. Sam continued to buy land and took it all, as much as he could get, all the way up to the border with Maryland. Sam wanted his own little enclave out there for hunting and other purposes. So you can see a picture of the cowboy in the museum on one of the walls, but Sam even hired a cowboy from Wyoming, came out on the train with his horse, and the cowboy would patrol the land and would not allow anybody to come on Sam Field's property. With his rifle, he'd usher them back. Well, Assateague was always a struggling village. Couldn't attract a doctor, couldn't attract a teacher, couldn't attract a minister, and then Sam comes along and makes it so that they can't even get to the ocean to salvage. And the other story is, and I'm sorry, I forget his name. Again, he's in the museum, a picture of him. The man who ran the general store, the last one to leave Assateague. Before he'd open up the store, every morning he would walk over to Tom's Cove, reach down, grab a couple oysters, pop them open with his knife. Down they'd go, that was breakfast, and he'd go back to work. And that's how you lived on Assateague Island, off of seafood and what you could grow. But now they can't get to seafood, they can't get to the beach anymore. They figured this is it, we're done for. So in the 1920s, they picked up as many homes as they could afford to, put them on barges, and brought them over to Chincoteague. If you take the history tour with the museum, I believe they mention, they may even point out, there are 7, 8, or 9 homes on East Side Drive that were Assateague homes, and they're now on Chincoteague. Sam